Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to Eclectic Eccentrics, a series in which we will be looking at some marvellous and some not so marvellous individuals who have been described as eccentric somewhere along the way. Their stories might delight, terrify, or intrigue you, but they will always entertain. Salutations to you explorers of the weird and wonderful. Welcome aboard, don your life jackets, and let down the sails as we venture into the choppy waters of today's episode. I must add that our Eclectic Eccentric has absolutely nothing to do with sailing or the ocean. We are, however, looking at someone who, depending on what circles you move in, you may know very well already, or perhaps not at all. You may also be familiar with their father, as he was a well-known eccentric who banned electricity in his house, decorated cows, and invented a musical toothbrush. But enough about him, for in today's episode, I am of course talking about the poet Edith Sitwell. Edith Sitwell was born on the 7th of September 1887 in Scarborough, England. As touched upon in the intro, she was the daughter of a well-known eccentric, Sir George Sitwell, who in turn was the husband of Lady Ida Emily Augusta. Edith had a turbulent childhood by all accounts, and later in life she described it as an extremely unhappy time, detailing her mother's rages and how her father used to lock her in an iron frame in an attempt to cure her of a spinal deformity. Edith was a striking-looking woman and lived with Marfan syndrome, giving Edith a unique and somewhat angular look. An artist you may have heard of, a certain Pablo Picasso, who knew Edith during her adult life, described her face as a collector's piece. Edith described him as a delightful, kindly, friendly, simple little man. By the time she was 26, Edith had moved out of her family home and was beginning to ply her trade as a creative individual, predominantly as a poet, an area where she excelled. This is a short extract from her most famous poem, Still Falls the Rain. It is a poem about the suffering that World War II brought to the world. Still falls the rain, dark as the world of man, black as our loss, blind as the 1940 nails upon the cross. Still falls the rain, with a sound like the pulse of the heart that is changed to the hammer beat in the potter's field, and the sound of impious feet. On the tomb still falls the rain. In the field of blood, where the small hopes breed, in the human brain nurtures its greed, that worm with the brow of Cain. There has been, as you would expect, a lot written about Edith's poetry by those with a poetry know-how far surpassing mine, so if you want to find out more about her written work, go and have a read of those. Edith experimented a lot with sound, with rhythms and how poetry was delivered. Back in the 1920s, she wrote a series of poems collectively called Facade. The poems were accompanied by jazz music. However, when first performing this, the whole ensemble, including Edith, used to sit behind a curtain with a circular hole cut in it. Edith would then push a megaphone through the hole and then begin the performance. I appreciate compared to some of the so-called art these days, this doesn't sound like much, but back in those days, it would have been very unusual to have poetry shouted at you through a curtain via a megaphone, and this did cause quite a stir. It's safe to say that Edith was not universally popular with critics, but then again, is art really art if it doesn't receive some negative reaction? Newspaper articles criticised her poems and art, calling it drivel, which apparently Edith very much enjoyed. Edith was someone who understood that, occasionally, new young artists needed help, so she would introduce upcoming performers to agents and would write favourable reviews of their work. Despite this, however, she was not averse to speaking her mind and giving as good as she got when it came to a feud. On one occasion, she fell out with Noel Coward, an actor who, amongst other things, played the part of Mr. Bridger in the original Italian Job film. Coward saw a performance of Edith's, didn't like it, and therefore made a satirical rebuttal in which Edith and her brothers were parodied. Edith and Coward were, from then on, in Edith's view, sworn enemies, and exchanged various digs at each other. Coward described Edith as an eager, egocentric dragon, with Edith stating that Coward had a talent that amuses, but does not endure. They eventually made up and became friends again, however, 40 years later. Despite her creative endeavours, in which she was very successful, Edith was a shy person. However, you may not have known this given she used to wear some fantastically outrageous outfits. She found her signature look thanks perhaps to the greatest love of her life, a chap called Pavel Chechlyshev. However, this relationship was not as it may sound on initial hearing. Pavel was gay, and although they nurtured a close friendship and were evidently very fond of each other, their relationship was never romantic, which appeared very difficult for Edith to take. Pavel did, however, design some clothing for her, clothing which then formed Edith's look from there on in. Her clothing was elaborate, and she was known to wear things such as golden turbans, medieval-style dresses like some Tudor queen, and huge rings on every finger. I'm sure they looked far more impressive than the rings you'd get from a Christmas cracker, or a packet of Haribo. I should also add that she did wear this jewellery to bed. It wasn't all just for appearance though. As a lifelong hypochondriac, Edith always wore gloves to open her letters, fearing infection from any rogue germs. There are plenty of photographs of her online if you want to get an idea of how Edith looked in her various styles of clothing. As the years wore on, and Edith gained popularity given her wartime poems like Still Falls the Rain, she lent into the image that others had created. She claimed, for example, that she could communicate with peacocks, a claim which, unfortunately, was never proven. On another occasion she posed for some photographs where at times she appeared as if she was dead. This was used to cement her image of being a bit of a theatrical goth. Edith Sitwell was certainly a very complex and, arguably in some ways, a curated character, but certainly a gifted creative. A lot has been written about her writing and the impact that she had on poetry. In the interest of brevity and to ensure that the focus of this podcast is maintained, I have not strayed into a critical commentary regarding her work, and I'm also not a scholar in such things, so I'm very aware I wouldn't really add anything of note anyway. Edith's appearance and so-called eccentricity have arguably taken a bit of attention away from her work, so please trust me when I say I have only scratched the surface of Edith Sitwell. Before I go, however, I just want to draw your attention to a certain little book she wrote, called English Eccentrics. It is, as you would expect, a wild ride, and full of stories and anecdotes about eccentrics throughout English history, some of which have appeared in this very podcast. You'll have to read the book to find out which ones though. This book is also in part the reason why I started this podcast. I was very much taken by some of the people I read about in the book, and I've always had a personal interest in those curious individuals who lead life in their own way. This podcast was a good excuse for me to learn about those who have been called eccentrics and their important place in this strange old world of ours. Not that Edith would ever have seen herself as an eccentric, however, once saying, "I am not eccentric. It's just that I am more alive than most people. I am an unpopular electric eel set in a pond of catfish." Edith Sitwell died on the 9th of December 1964 at the age of 77, a couple of years after being awarded the title of Companion of Literature by the Royal Society of Literature, the first woman to be awarded such an accolade. She certainly was an electric eel in a pond of catfish. And that draws episode 3 of the series to a close, and what a treat it has been, with a little bit of history, a little bit of poetry, and a lot of eccentricity. Not too shabby if I say so myself. Whatever could be in store for us next? Well, you'll have to wait to the next episode, I suppose. So until then, I say goodbye.